Gents, welcome back to another episode of the Unfair Fight. I think we have some cool stuff to talk about. We've seen some new tactics and techniques from some of the bad guys in the past couple of weeks, and I think the theme is it's not really a new theme, but some new tactics that we're seeing, which is hardcore live off the land, really leveraging a lot of IT tools and techniques. So specifically, one of the topics we wanted to dive into today is a lot of managed IT service providers and frankly, IT shops that run networks all run kind of documentation, network management type tools, right? We all know that kind of challenge of having live network maps, or at least ones that can automatically be built, health and status on network devices, servers, and everything. I think we saw kind of similar. No, not in the same vein, but similar techniques leveraging SolarWinds, by the Russians. But now we're starting to see some more of the criminal groups and ransomware groups leverage this. So, Exa and David, I'll toss it over to you guys. I mean, we got to observe, this one's almost in real time here, kind of a breach of an MSP's documentation tool that teed them up and their customers up to have some malicious remote access. Do you want to kind of give a little overview on kind of how this stuff goes down, and maybe we could cover some lessons learned for MSPs to implement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to think about it. The document control systems, what do MSPs mostly have in there? Network maps. Sometimes they put credentials in there. I know some have password managers in there. They hold a lot. And it's not just for, what's the scary part about it all is it's not just for one customer. I mean, they use these across all their tenants as a single source to have that, and it's kind of, you have to have it, right? It's not like saying these products are bad. You got to have some type of document management system to run a proper shop on that. But it kind of shows it's almost like cloud live off the land type tactics, right? You're like migrating from you're acting like an admin on these cloud app tools, poking around, maybe you get into the document system. Document system has documentation about maybe other systems you have, like a Dropbox account, a Box account, or something like that. And you can kind of keep unfolding it that way and migrating around. And it really shows, how, there's a lot of interesting stuff outside of what's inside of your network. That could be very sensitive data. What do you think?
Yeah, David? the inclusion of convenience is the biggest flaw in security there. Like the fact that you can then map in third-party tools, other APIs, other integrations, suddenly opens up it's no different than actually owning an MSP, right? If you own an MSP, you own every single one of their customers. If you own their documentation system that's integrated with all these other apps, you've got the keys to the kingdom. And it's scary, it's terrifying, but organizations can't get around not using it. As X rightly said, you need to have some form of documentation store. You need to have some form of method of storing your passwords, monitoring your systems. And we talk about it all the time, right? Understanding your assets and what you have to protect is a core critical component of providing security.
Right.
If you don't know what's running on your network, you're not really protecting properly. But
even up to your cloud assets or services,
exactly.
Consider that like an asset.
Tools, yeah, but these tools allow you to do that in a really nice, concise way. So when unfortunately they do get owned or maliciously accessed, it is a big issue. Fortunately, we don't see it all that often. I think this is
why this event is so notable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
and maybe we don't see it often because no one's looking. That's one thing you always got to remember.
These aren't locations that traditional endpoint type security products will ever see, right? This is purely in the domain of the MSP, and there's not really anyone that can monitor this stuff. What's kind of funny is I always felt, that as when you're operating more in the offensive or the kind of adversary side of the coin, when you break into a network, you don't know how they're designed. Are they mostly an on-prem? Are they on-prem with some hybrid? Do they have a big distributed workforce? This is all stuff you have to figure out. And when you think about, the advantages when an adversary targets an MSP, they can hit one company potentially and hit 50, 100 or more end customers. I mean, I know we all saw the threat intel a couple of weeks ago where, a threat actor is saying, hey, I have access to someone's kind of, probably hypervisor or some sort of cloud control panel. There's like 50 plus customers. I need some help to action, exploiting all these customers and bringing the pain. But I think in my experience, one of the most effective and also kind of most effective methods of breaking into a network is systematically, as you gain more information, documenting it and going specifically after, back in the day it was Visio diagrams, right? But when you think about platforms that are allowing you to pull config states, store them, document them, I think there's a lot of nuance that folks need to take into account when they roll these out. And I'm going to admit freely up front, some of this nuance and, my personal recommendations are less efficient. However, when you think about yourself in the shoes of an MSP owner, it's having one of these events can be existential, right? So, specifically what I mean by this is, how do these documentation tools and network management and monitoring tools, get configured traditionally, right? If it's a router, switch, some sort of appliance type device, it's almost always, either SNMP, syslog, some auth, or frankly, it's a login or a connection via an API, right? So there's going to be privileged credentials provisioned in one form or fashion. When it comes to servers, you have options and workstations, and I think those options sit as, how do you access that? I know in previous podcasts we've talked, and I do not believe in privileged vulnerability scans, and I do not believe in privileged network management tools. And what we mean by this is, I have a domain admin level, set of credentials, and I'm going to remotely authenticate on a machine and execute, PowerShell or via WMIC or WinRM. That I think is bad. And so where these tools can really go from, they're very convenient to help you document, to your worst nightmare is when you arm it with those creds. Because what happens when there's a compromise there? Great, you just gave everyone domain admin on all your customers. So now they're going to look for things like, go to my PC, log me in, any sort of remote access tool that they can immediately, hit and log in with those credentials. And so I think, my advice, I'm curious to what your guys' thought is, if you're going to be running, you need info from your servers for health, maintenance, documentation, config settings, whatever. The agents that, one, it needs to be agent based, and two, those agents need to run a system, take commands from your cloud and upload that data, as opposed to, authing remotely with privileged credentials. I open up to you guys. I'm curious to your thoughts, because I think from this latest thing we're watching, they had lots of domain admin creds in there, and that was bad.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point about privilege scanning or putting internal credentials into these cloud tools. Like, it may seem like maybe an easy button on that side of things, but you got to remember that you're putting in highly sensitive credentials into a system you don't own. Of course, you want to trust your vendors, and we'll say that you did your due diligence, right? Wink, wink. But you're putting those very sensitive credentials in there. And what we've experienced in some of the incident responses, just one last night that we've been around on, is that even you make these credentials for them, right? And then maybe it contracts up, it goes away. No one ever seems to remember to remove those service accounts, to remove any of this credentialed access. So then you look in your AD and you have 40 service accounts that are just sitting there ready to be taken advantage of, that are pretty much domain admins. And we see it a lot too. And that's what these hackers are targeting too. When we catch hackers, they're using things like VMware accounts. They rarely actually use a domain admin account. They're using these service accounts because it blends in, using Commvault accounts to spread around. So, it brings on that type of another interesting fact too, is that, you got to audit, all the service accounts you have, along with the people accounts too. That's in your system. And and I know there's on the second fact is being agent based. I know everyone always said agent was a bad word, but I feel like agent was a bad word because computers weren't ready for such hard, core disk thrashing. Almost all computers have SSDs now. They got a lot of memory, and I feel like with the advances of computers, I mean, like if you look at endpoint agents, some of them, I don't know, name one. I bet you it hasn't increased in footprint over the years as how you've gotten better computers. So maybe it's a little bit of a hot take, but I feel like being agent based isn't much of a banned word right now. With some,
I know we run tons of agents on our setup.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell you I've noticed one in a long time. And if I do, then there's like some serious issues with it, or it's some runaway logging sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think
hammering WMI. Yeah.
Well, best practice, as you said, right? Agent used to be a bad word, and now a lot of developers, when they're thinking of an agent, they think about how to make it quiet. How do you do it so that it doesn't, cause problems? Because if you cause problems, then people don't want to use it. But it is. I think it is a much safer way of doing things, right? You should never really be accessing a system with domain credential if you can get around it. The other thing as well, and it's probably not talked about as much because it's never really been a thing outside of maybe security services, but restricting the level of access to documentation. So segregate out what you're storing. You don't need to have a single domain, let's take your IT documentation. You don't need to have every single server on one account as one privileged user. Have a few different privileged users if you want that you have access to, and each one has a subsection of your network diagram. If you really want to, if you want to be safe, ask yourself the question of who has access to the system and what do I actually want them to see? As organizations, they want to be open and transparent. You want all your employees to feel like you're part of this and that you have a stake in it. But do they really need to know everything that's stored in that platform? Do they really need access to all the documentation, or do they just need a subset to do their job?
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about is how do you access said documentation, network management, RMM platform from an administrative standpoint, and how do you put as many barriers in place to get there? I mean, a couple simple ones. MFA is an obvious one, but obviously, we were out at DEF CON. Not that we needed that to know, but there's more and more MFA bypass techniques. But, little things like you can have MFA, but you can also lock it down to certain logins, right? So maybe you have to VPN to your cloud with MFA, and only from that location can you log into the other platform with MFA. Having a couple, almost like a little bit of a air gap's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. It's kind of like a little virtual air gap between these platforms to make it extra hard to get to them. If they're just sitting live on the internet and you can log right in, it can be kind of dangerous. And these are platforms that have highly privileged creds that can, some can even the same applies to RMMs. They can execute, commands in your behalf. So I think this is an area, MSPs, you're going to watch, I think, a lot more attention from the bad guys. Because think about it, like figuring out where you are in an environment and making sense of it is hard. And when you have a system that documents it all for you and has passwords in it, like that's kind of, you couldn't ask for more.
Right, exactly.
This is, as Zach said, right, those service accounts, when no one's doing the sanitization, ignoring the fact that you're not removing them because they're no longer part of the contract, they're not getting the same updates and security updates as your other accounts. Instead of using MFA, maybe they only have one form of authentication because they're so old they've never been updated. I dread to think, but it could possibly happen. It's terrifying when you stop and think about it properly. You're like, well, this is bad news. We saw, 3 months ago, everyone was like, if an MSP gets owned, we're seeing targeted MSPs. Well, this strikes me as something infinitely worse.
Yeah. I think, they're what hackers tend to be really good at, and, kind of any cyber adversary is taking advantage of a platform no one's really talking about. I actually think, historically at the elite level, people have been targeting networking documentation at the pro level and nation state level forever, because especially as you go into larger and larger networks, it's, one of these questions we always ask our SOC analysts when they're in the interview process, if they even understand like fundamentals of networking, right? Why would a SOC analyst typically care if they understand what happens with broadcast traffic between subnets? Well, the real reason is when you're targeting an adversary, you need to understand what they can see.
Yep.
And in their view. And one of the hardest things in larger environments is understanding the true network layout and design. Yeah, you can interrogate the domain controller. Yes, you can get accounts, but you don't just see all the other subnets. You don't know their purpose. And if you're after really specific data or targeting a specific person, it can be tricky. Well, network diagrams, it used to be like MRTG servers back in the day were really awesome because, you're going to get, and, a lot of times you read write SMP community string, and you can do a lot of damage with those in the networking world. But it can really shorten the timeline. And also, when you think of it from the MSP standpoint, you're probably getting the MSP's network in addition to all of their customer networks, and that's what we just watched happen.
Right.
And my gut is that it was just due to really poor IT hygiene. But it's a little TBD in this case. We'll have to watch it play out and see how it is. But I think it is a really important takeaway for MSPs to understand your network documentation, network management platforms are also crown jewels, and you need to protect them as such.
Yeah,
Maybe switching gears a little bit to more live off the land, kind of tradecraft we've seen in it's our favorite, least favorite ransomware group out there. We believe, Black Cat, they're highly capable from what we've observed. And, you have to respect the skills. Obviously they're on the wrong side of the fence for us, but you must respect the skills. X or David, do you want to get a little bit of an overview of, what we observe them doing? Because I think it is really, really important, for MSPs and anyone running a network for that matter to understand there's a couple ways to ransom a place. It doesn't just have to happen at the host level operating system.
Yeah, I'll take it back and show some interesting kind of, I won't say tactics, but kind of behaviors that kind of separated the Black Hat ransomware group from other ones we deal with all the time. A lot of the other ones we deal with all the time, as soon as you stop them, as soon as you get rid of their their access, you catch them really quick. We do it all the time. They usually don't come back because there's bigger, there's someone else with open RDP somewhere, and they'll just move there. But we found out with this group, they like that's like challenge accepted to them, and they'll be like, okay, we'll come back. So it shows you just really, a lot, especially like even with us, we catch a lot of things really early on. So it might not seem like it's a huge deal. It's like, oh, someone, launched Cobalt Strike on a machine and tried to get to another machine. And everyone's like, oh, big deal. I'll reimage this machine. But you got to think, this is like the first steps in that. They could have, they could have other things running, something that got past automated defenses on the machine. You got to reset the password. You got to really take this like a real IR type engagement and really kind of go to the full breadth of making sure that this is contained, because these guys have been coming. We've seen it time and time again. These people, the Black Hat group will try to come back, and they're very advanced type of threat actors. So I thought that was very interesting. We usually don't see.
Yeah, they're a lot more persistent, and I don't mean persisting like back. Reboots and stuff like that. I mean, they don't give up easily. And the other thing, they operate so much more nation state like to me. In that,
it does feel
they
different.
really prioritize having multiple forms of remote access fast up front in the operation. So they kind of have like primary, at least from our side observing, it's like I have my primary objective. I'm going to try and ransom the network this way. But if that doesn't work, they immediately fall back to another avenue, and their ability to ad lib on the fly, really impressive to me.
You know what it makes me think of? Red teamers. They're not operating the same as other cyber criminals, which could, in essence, be summarized as script kiddies, right? They try one thing, it doesn't work, they move on because
they don't know anything outside the playbook. Right? Really. They don't have the freedom of creative thought. They're more like special operations of hackers, where they're very
like
creative.
You broke their script at step 3, and they don't know. That's it then.
Yeah. Whereas the Black Hat guys, as you said, something comes up, we stop them, they try and find another way around it. I think they've got their playbooks, because obviously, something's going to work 90% of the time. And we discussed it before, right? We saw them doing...
And we still see the same tools, right, David, that we wrote an article about months ago.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And even when we stopped them this time, they threw in a couple of different ones, but the behaviors were exactly the same as the first time round. But when we stopped them, that's when their playbook changed, and it's very clear that they aren't just a simple rinse and repeat. They're doing proper testing. They're thinking about what they're doing, and that shows no more so than the actual ransomware itself. You know that it's not encrypted, it's not obfuscated, it's clearly designed to get around machine learning based AV engines. If you had a signature based one, you'd probably catch it, but they've clearly worked out that the majority of the community has moved on to machine learning based. And so they've tested it, they've worked out a way around it. And
well, they
that
also like
shows
to
their
just
level
use
of-
tools that won't pop on anyone because they're totally legit. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
separates
Right,
them to me. Is like they're the best group I've ever seen at living off the land. I will
Yep.
say, we did see in a latest attempt them leveraging or what we believe to be them leveraging PDQ deploy, which was the first time I've seen them do that. Which so for everyone listening out there, any software that can be used to deploy,
right.
consider that one fair game, to be used maliciously. But these things won't pop. I mean, in this latest one we saw, not only was there a complete targeting of the host-based operating, it's a very virtualized environment. Not only is there complete targeting of that with, again, the standard tool sets we've been seeing, IT tools for software deployment, network enumeration, and, ability to get kind of remote screen access and execute commands, behind the scenes. They completely targeted the hypervisor and storage area network side of this as well.
Yep.
And that's the part that was quite interesting. PDQ deploy was the first time we've seen them use that particular tool. So if you're not using that in your environment, kind of pro tip here is monitor for that popping up.
Absolutely.
That can, obviously we look for that stuff all the time, but that can be a real indicator up front. X or Dave, do you want to go into a little bit of maybe some of the mistakes this particular network, obviously we're not going to name names, made that allowed the adversary to, I would say, operate with an information asymmetry advantage against their target, even when it comes to kind of the hypervisor and underlying, virtual hard drive infrastructure. You guys want to give the audience a little bit of a description of that and things to watch out for, and how to prevent this from happening and make that a lot harder.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, make sure that your security product is deployed on all your endpoints. I know it's a big one, and I know that sounds like we're selling ourselves. I really don't care if it's us or if it's someone else. If you buy a security product, put it on all the devices. You're paying that money for a reason, and the second you don't, you're putting your arm behind your back and going, I can still box. It's fine.
Speaking of deployment software, right? Instead of deploying ransomware, make sure you're deploying security products.
Yeah. This is the worst part. I'll be totally candid. We see an issue, and I think part of it is unintentional, and part of it is absolutely intentional, driven by economic pressures. Right. And those, I respect because they're hard, and there's only so much money you can get out of your end customer. But what we see time and time and time again are folks will push a partial deployment of a higher end security product in an interest to protect what they think are the critical assets. But let's be candid. How many people have actually broken into networks for a living out there and can truly understand like this is critical, this is not? Because, if you're using, for example, like a privileged vulnerability scanning or a privileged network documentation tool, those boxes you didn't think were critical still might have creds you can steal from them because you can wait for those tools to kind of auth, right? And now you can get into the token stealing game. And so I think, one thing you have to do, if you're going to settle on a security stack, you need to put it everywhere. Stop trying to thread this needle of I'm just going to protect these ones because I can afford it and not these ones, because time and time again, that bites you. And it makes your security team really, like David said, you're fighting with your arms tied behind your back. You can't see patient zero because someone didn't deem that device critical enough. And in the case of this particular event we're talking about, we had essentially a Horizon server sitting directly connected to the internet, running as a virtual machine. as well as a vSphere, kind of instance with no security protection on them. So first off, mistake number one, this crap is not meant to be on the internet, straight up.
Right.
That has to be hyper protected, right? Mistake number two, the backup infrastructure was essentially virtual machines running on the same underlying unified infrastructure that you connected directly to the internet. Right. So you can protect all the host OS stuff in the world and crush the bad guy and do great there. But when you leave its underlying hosting platform exposed to the world, you're kind of screwed, and you're going to lose all your backups on top of that.
You know, putting all your eggs in one basket, that one.
And if there's been enough warnings on kind of ESXi vulnerabilities and things like that from CISA and everyone else, I know we've sent them out to our base. This is why you truly need to audit your environment, and why you got to get out of this kind of DMZ or quasi DMZ design model if you can. That was, made it really, John. Really difficult.
Right, I agree with that. And another thing is, I'll give this. This is my MSP tip of the day, or of this podcast. We always hear when we talk to we catch stuff on the internet all the time. We're like, do you really need this? And they're like, well, customer said that that was it. It's like, well, how about this? Your customer doesn't understand the security or the risk of this thing being on the internet. So just let them know the best way. This is a tactic I like to use a lot when we're talking to people. Is if they're just going to be hard no on everything and it's going to happen, the best case scenario is to get them to think, right? So what you can tell them is being like, okay, if you want to leave, say, Horizon on the internet, when someone gets in, because they're going to get in, this is what they'll have access to: all your VMs, all your storage SAN. So if you're okay with the risk of all that happening, or getting access because we left something on the internet, or it's your accounting system that could take you out of business if they take all that or ransom it. Just let them know what it means. And sometimes you'll get the wheel spinning, and they'll be like, well, okay, maybe logging into a VPN with MFA is not that bad compared to getting everything smashed, because it will happen. Really
maybe offer an alternative design.
Yeah, an alternative design. Yeah.
Right. Like a zero trust network access. Yeah. You can still get to your server, guys. You just don't have to do it by leaving that raw service,
One service to look at, too. We'll use it for some hosted stuff that we have is Cloudflare Access. You can actually build an SSO tunnel in front of an internal web app with Cloudflare Access. And, it's got, you can get right to the server. It's all behind SSO. It's not on the internet. I mean, it's a great service. That if someone just needs access to like one app, so you don't have to build a whole VPN, around it. Say it is VMware, say it is Horizon, put that behind, some type of, of other authentication, something that's, so people, and it also protects you a lot from people slinging zero-day exploits. You never know when a 0 day is going to come out, because it's called a 0 day for a reason. Just get them thinking a little bit,
Actually, you brought up a great kind of point, and this is why I've been harping. People sometimes take exception when I'm like, DMZs need to be dead. It was a great, I used to be a network engineer. It was a great design for a long time, but everyone screws it up. That's step one. Two, when you have still that on-prem domain controller, or even part on-prem, part in cloud, when you have any service listening at any service, it could be your VPN services listening at a boundary, and behind said boundary, there is a full-on traditional Windows domain. There's hosts and all that stuff. You risk misconfiguring your DMZ rules. We see this still multiple times a week with malicious intrusions.
Networking's hard.
By having any service up and listening, you could be vulnerable to just frankly a credential harvesting attack, right? Where they've gotten creds and they can just log in. It's always that joke, hacking or login, right? So that's another one. And then the third part you mentioned, X, was kind of your susceptibility to a 0 day that may or may not, exist yet, but it could come out, and you want to reduce that kind of exposure. I mean, when I think about this Horizon thing, guess what? A vulnerability scanner wouldn't have told the customer this was bad, because there wasn't a vulnerable service with a known running exploit on this one. You know what it was? Mm-hmm. You could log into the damn thing. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. So when you're seeing web servers, you need to take a look at what's their purpose in life. And I really encourage everyone to do this type of scanning. One, because it can save you from a horrific day. But two, the other issue is when you go to apply for insurance, guess who else is going to do this scanning? Right? You need to be insurable, and you need to have a defensible and effective, kind of stack and look on the outside in. So I really encourage folks, if it has to listen externally, get it in the cloud or make access zero trust, not through traditional kind of full tunnel VPNs. I think we really, as an industry, need to move away from this stuff.
Yeah. And personally, one of the ways I think of making sure, because as you said, right, that wouldn't have been caught by a vulnerability scanner. But if you make sure that you're doing regular pen tests every 6 months, you're doing sanitization where you're bringing someone in that is not just going to vulnerability scan your network, but critically analyze what you're doing and what you're trying to do and come back and say to you, you don't need this here. This is dangerous.
Right.
That's the best thing forward. Because, you know what, I honestly believe insurers will start doing that in the future. They're going to start hiring red teams to do these scans, not just vulnerability scans, purely because they're going to do these proper assessments of what they're about to insure. I don't think
especially when the policies have real high limits,
Oh, yeah.
This would probably be, for really large, kind of service providers.
Ones, yeah. Do you know, just on your point, X, where you mentioned, going in and talking with the customer and kind of giving them that negative impact. Last week with Andrew on Black Point Command, there was a really interesting talk basically about how MSPs can sell without pushing the products down someone's throat, but talking them through, well, if you don't have this is what you're exposing yourself to. So I fully encourage anyone that...
You don't want to be all funny about it either, but, just transparent is probably the best way to put it.
Exactly. Like, tell them the same thing that any other security professional will tell them that, that's fine. You can have that level of access, but you expose yourself to all of these kind of things. That's a really interesting watch for anyone that just wants to learn a little bit of a way of having those conversations with customers.
Yeah, I think that's you brought up a great point, David. I hate the FUD sales process. The things like the average breach costs a company your size this. It's like, no. You want to talk to the prospect and really understand what makes their business tick.
Yeah.
Right. What drives your revenue? What drives your retention? What drives your brand? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And understand how IT is supporting those functions. And then think about applying security, to protect those kind of crown jewels in a way that follows industry best practices, that makes you insurable and that makes you defensible, even if all hell breaks loose and it gets bad, so you can actually recover. And it's not something where you're going out of business, because, we're watching premiums go up a lot and coverage go down, which means, especially on ransom, which means, end customer, you and an MSP, you're going to have to take on some of this risk yourself.
Yeah.
Right. And that's something, folks really have to think about, is like, you have to actually protect yourself a bit. There's not always going to be someone to bail you out.
It's pretty interesting. I saw an article the other day that talked about how companies are saying they want governments to stand up some of the money for these ransoms, to say, well, you need to bail us out if we get ransomed. I honestly don't think that'll go anywhere. I think they'll turn around and say, you need to buy insurance, and then the insurers will say you need to follow best practice. But it's clearly something companies are concerned about.
Right.
But there's so much information out there that will help them solve the problem. And limit the problem as much as possible.
Right.
So
I still recommend, and I know I beat this horse to death every podcast, but for those out there, just if you need a starting point, look at CIS. Right. CIS has kind of these benchmarks and controls. So, you could think of one of them as like, here's my tactics, right? I got to configure this a certain way in my Microsoft 365 Azure environment or my domain harden. And the other one is kind of like general classes of industry standard best behavior. And we're watching the insurers really like CS. We're a huge fan of it because it's pragmatic and it works if you follow it. And I think for MSPs, if you adopt kind of that CIS first mentality, or even that kind of NIST, those 5 pillars, you got to identify your assets, you got to harden and reduce your attack surface. You have to have a detection capability that isn't just malware. Right. You have to be able to detect, malicious use of legitimate tools, because that's how the pros actually win most of the time, like straight up. That enables a huge part of the progression, and it always has. The backdoors and exploits are always sexy, and they can result in a lot of bad, but they're just one tool in the quiver of the bad guys. And then you need some ability to respond to either one of those fast, because time is not on your side in this game, and the consequences are rather high. And then lastly, you need to orient yourself towards, okay, we have an event, maybe it defeated some of the security controls. You have to assume that could happen. Maybe everything we did up to it going right of boom helped actually contain how much damage it could do, and now we have a plan in place to recover and stay in the game. I mean, it's only natural. As companies, we're completely relying on IT to even operate anymore. It's natural you're going to have disruptions to that. And so you need to be prepared in a pragmatic way.
You mentioned the price point, though, but I think part of the problem there is that people assume buying one thing is going to be that silver bullet. You don't have to buy an entire company's security stack to offer
unless
protection.
It's ours, of course. But
I was about to say, hold on, David.
But I mean, you mentioned the cyber defense matrix. Like, go through it. Have a look at what you're actually trying to protect, what you're trying to do, and look at the different companies that fit within that matrix. Don't just blindly spend, because you'll start to question why you've spent so much money on something that's not actually offering the protection you wanted, or the thing that you're trying to do.
And I think
it's the same advice to hiring security professionals. Understand what you're trying to do before you go hiring them.
Yeah. It's funny. This podcast is always about the tech bits, and I feel like we're drifting more into like how to orient your stack stuff.
I know, right?
But it is important because I see this like continuing issue where it's like, I have 40 customers. I've already sold them a contract, and the game is changing, right? And now they need more security, I think, but they won't pay, right? And I think you have to complete. And then when they do pay for a point solution, maybe each year you sold them. One year you sold them DNS, next year you sold them EDR, then you're selling them MDR or something like that. And now you're trying to show like, look what it stopped and saved you from. Like the reality is, most people aren't hacked, but when it does happen, you need to be really, really prepared. And trying to have this kind of, you spend $1 on this, it equals we caught X. It's not a repeatable approach to delivering value. And this is where I really think, MSPs have to think long and hard about a default stack. And, one of our reps actually has a kind of interesting saying, which I actually believe, like, how many of your end customers deserve to get ransomware? Because they didn't buy your security plus, do they deserve to get ransomware? At the end of the day, you're their IT team. They still think, you're going to protect them. And so what you should more think about is, how do I build a defensible, pragmatic stack that is, a huge value driver of coming with me as an MSP as opposed to, my competitors, right? So that's step one. Because why is that important? One, it makes your sales and value cycle better. Two, the insurers are actually going to like you because you have a freaking plan and you've covered kind of the bases on the industry best practices, right? Three, it works. Most of the time it works really, really well. And then you can focus on building efficiencies in other parts of your IT operation, automation, figuring out how to do more with less on the human capital side. That is where you should be sinking your teeth into, because that's your core competency as an MSP, right? And just optimize the hell of that side and stop making the security, a premium upsell here, premium upsell there. I know it's easier said than done, but when you look at those that have done it the best and grown the biggest and have the best margins, they tend to have that more structured approach. And it's better for your end customer, I think, and it's better for reputation. None of us in the MSP world, need more stories popping up in the news or more threat intel that, hacker has access to, potentially 50 or 100 customers and they want to smash them.
No one likes to read that.
It drags down our entire industry and continues to perpetuate the fact that insurers are terrified.
No,
this. So we have to do better as an industry, and I don't think it's going to come from this point solution upselling type stuff.
No.
But so Anyway, I think a couple key takeaways, guys, and I know folks have wanted a little tighter, concise, and I think some of the content we covered today, I'd almost like to wrap this one way earlier than we normally do, because I want to leave folks with a couple takeaways, which is step one, or point one: hackers are going to continue to be more creative and clever and target those platforms you don't think necessarily are holding your crown jewels, aka documentation, network management platforms, vulnerability scanners, especially if there's some sort of remote way to log in. So think about those. There's more than just your RMM that can be incredibly enabling to an adversary, right? So that's step one, or point one. Point two is you really need to take a look at that kind of critical infrastructure from a network design standpoint, especially in highly virtualized environments. If you have an underlying hypervisor layer with the storage area network and all your VMs on it, please do not back up to that because you have to have a single point of failure under the hood. You got to bifurcate that. Point three, DMZs got to go. Stop doing them, right? Let's also try as an industry move past just full tunnel remote access. Even with MFA, I'd like to move to more application-based access, whether it's hosted in the cloud or on-prem and brokered, through a platform with MFA. Anything you guys want to add to kind of some of those points?
No, those are great points, and more on the tech side too. Just make sure that when you get a call from your MDR provider, you do have some process in place to do the full incident. Never brush anything off. Always take everything serious. When in regards to security, just I always say, we always tell everybody to always take the hammer down approach. No matter what, even if AV half blocks something, you think it's fine. Don't want to take the risk of bringing that thing back online. Just re-image it, move on.
Right.
Especially these days when everything is in OneDrive or blah 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 drive. It's not as detrimental as it used to be to have to perform this type of stuff. So yeah, I just want to just to make sure everyone's prepared and takes everything serious and knows that someone coming in your network and installing total network deployment doesn't sound bad, right? So, but there's a ransomware group behind this, and don't take it as just being like, oh, some kid got in and wanted to deploy, or maybe he just wanted to trial some software on my network. I don't know. This is adversaries. These are bad guys. This is 100% serious. So just make sure, we all keep that mindset. And then, it's always a good story too, to like the customer also on your end customer, the MSP's end customer being like, got this, got it out, done, all's done. Just letting you know what happened. And they're like, oh, sweet. My investment is good. So,
The X, I want to double click on one point you made that we see all the time. Right. So let's say you're running an EDR. EDR catches something. It's like threat cleaned. Do you know how many times when we see threat cleaned or quarantined, and we're not going to name vendors, that we go and check and it's still sitting on disk and it actually never cleaned it?
Some of them lie.
So step one, when you see those alerts, you need to double click a couple layers deeper. Two, you know how many times we see them catch the automated solutions? And this isn't, granted, I think they're actually got really good, right? But they still miss all the time, and it's always going to be this. This is a cat and mouse game. How many times it'll catch just a teeny part of what was actually going on, and there's still a shell on that box. Right. Treat a quarantine, a detection, is maybe an alert that there could be a hell of a lot more going on under the surface, and run that to ground until you know better, because we see this every single day where it's a partial detection and a partial clean, or a clean it claims is good, but it really wasn't in real life and didn't happen. It could be that one step could be the difference between a really bad day or not.
Yep. Or them keep coming back and coming back and coming back. Coming back. Yeah. That's how we train our stock pretty much, is, always take a step back from the endpoint and be like, okay, where is this hack actually originating from? And luckily we have that type of data, because, the endpoint will tell you blah, blah, blah ran, but the endpoint product won't tell you that they RDP'd in from a terminal server, and then that terminal server is open to the internet. You know what I mean? So there's always take that step back and really understand. Yeah, that's a good point, John.
Yeah. I think one takeaway from me is don't get mad at your security professionals for doing their job. That's the honest truth. I would much rather that they were wrong and vigilant than miss something. in all honesty. You know, as you said, right, deployment of Screen Connect or deployment of total software deployment isn't necessarily something that is intrinsically bad in itself. But if there is enough suspicion that they take action on it, and it's just an admin doing their job, don't be annoyed that they've slowed you down, because it could have been so much worse if they hadn't.
For sure.
You know?
Great advice. Be curious.
Yeah.
Be very, very curious. And be hyper vigilant on this type of stuff, because many times you don't want to be catching them because you identified the ransomware kit, the ransomware toolkit.
Yeah,
that's too freaking late, by the way.
I mean,
and that's where most people are catching this stuff. That is way too late. John. There's a lot of indicators that come prior to that aren't that difficult to handle.
Well,
that, gents. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. I was going to say Black Cat is customized for your environment, so they're living in there for a while before they deploy it. Mm-hmm. And the best way to stop it, catch them before they do. Yeah.
And David, actually, one last thing. We've watched with Black Cat where they'll deploy a second copy of the exact same RMM or remote access tool you're using. So, and one hint that we've noticed is if your RMM tool is normally running a system, and then you see it running as like an actual privileged user account, and you see two of them, that's a pretty damn clear indicator there's one really bad one. And when you see it at that stage, this is a 5-alarm fire that you need to get on top of and put out very, very quickly. Yep. With that, gents, our shortest podcast ever, but I hope it's impactful and meaningful for the folks listening. So thank you so much for your wisdom, insight, and time. Until next time.
Always a pleasure.
All righty. See
you later, guys.
See you, everyone.